This episode is part of a series where I take already published memoir and break down what works about it and why, and what doesn't work and why. I found that when I'm teaching my memoir method concepts to writers, they benefit from seeing how these principles play out in memoir that you can find at the bookstore. This month, I'm looking at the memoir true crime hybrid, The Tragedy of True Crime by John J. Lennon, and today is part 2.
You are listening to the Memoir Method podcast, the place for writers, readers, and anyone who appreciates the collective power of our stories. In this podcast, we explore the impact of memoir alongside an examination of writing techniques and strategies used in the genre. Whether you are a writer looking for inspiration and guidance or a passionate reader seeking meaningful connections through shared experiences, the Memoir Method podcast is your go-to conversation spot. I'm your host, Charlotte, editor, writer, and the heart behind Charlotte Writes. Let's get started.
In this episode of Why It Works or Not, I'm diving into the narrative elements that Lennon uses in his memoir investigative journalism work, The Tragedy of True Crime. This book is a little different from other memoirs that we've examined together because of its hybrid nature. Last month's book, Renegade Agency by Andrea Verbanek, was also a hybrid memoir, but more from the angle of activism instead of the true crime investigative journalism that John J. Lennon goes at. So as a reminder, The Tragedy of True Crime follows 4 men, one of whom is the author of the book, through their lives within the prison system. You can go back to episode 103 to learn more about my assessment of the memoir's foundation, which is its focus, reader, and message. Let's talk about the structure of The Tragedy of True Crime, and I thought that this was very straightforward and very effective. The way that Lennon structured this book was intuitive. It was very easy to follow. So he presented both his story and the stories of the other 3 men that he uses as case studies in chronological order. So he goes through each person, starting in their childhoods and their pre-prison life. The book is divided into 4 acts. So you have Act 1, the meat, which is their backstories. He goes through each character, including himself, at their backstories and childhoods. Act 2 is the killing, which is their crimes. Each of these men, including himself, has committed and was convicted of murder. And then you have Act 3, their time, which is their imprisonment. This is the longest part of the book, going through the imprisonment. And he does go back and forth a bit among each of the men. It spans several chapters. He does make it clear which man he's talking about, including himself. And then Act 4 is the reckoning. So that is where he kind of lands the plane and talks about what this all means and why it matters. The chronological nature of the storytelling makes it easy to keep the stories together while also making it more impactful to Lennon's thesis. He wants to show the reader the humanity of men in the prison system who did commit their crimes. He does not make a point of ever arguing for his or others' innocence. He does make it clear that these men did commit these crimes. They do need to serve time. That is not an angle that he comes at this with. I know a lot of true crime work does seek to either exonerate someone or solve a crime. These crimes are solved. He is not advocating for anyone's innocence, including his own, but he does want to show that these men, including himself, who committed these crimes, are also human beings with complicated lives and stories. And he can do that better. He can execute his thesis better if he shows each phase for each man in the same breath, so to speak. So he makes it easy to track where we are in the lives of these people. He makes it easy to make sure, okay, we all know all this information. There's no cliffhangers. There's nothing like that. It's very, I think this is where his investigative journalism background and his training really comes into play well. He lays everything out so that the reader can pace with him. I want to talk about how he wrote about crime and prison. So usually when I'm coaching a writer, I tell them to lean into the sensory details so that the reader can experience the story with you. I would not have recommended that piece of advice to the author of this book, and I'm glad that that is not the narrative angle that he took in his storytelling. So remember from episode 103, that the reader in this case is a window reader. And so while the overwhelming majority of readers in this book are not violent criminals and have not been incarcerated, we are curious, and many of us have probably consumed true crime in some format. I can assure you that no normal reader wants an abundance of sensory details in this context. This goes with the book's thesis about commodifying true crime and analyzing the impact that true crime has on the perpetrators and not just the victims. Adding sensory details about the crimes or even too many about prison would risk sensationalizing this topic in a way that would undermine the writer's point. So he really handled that well, I thought. Let's talk about characters. When I'm working with a writer, we look at the people in their book. While they are real people, they are also characters. So I talk a lot about building out characters in my work with writers. And Lennon does a good job in this book of humanizing these violent criminals. As a reader, I am coming into this book, and I can just speak for myself, but I'm coming into this with a propensity toward compassion, as well as some systemic institutional criticism. I already see the complexities and the systemic factors working against these characters, especially with two of the incarcerated men that Lennon highlights. There's two, especially, that I see a lot of complexity in their cases and in how they were treated by the criminal justice system. What I found tricky was the author's characterization of himself. And this was true for another friend of mine who read the book as well. When you are writing memoir, you have to establish a narrator voice that is authoritative and trustworthy. You want the reader to look to you and think, oh, they've got me. I don't know exactly where we're going with this, but the author does. What makes this narrator version of the author tricky is that his prior actions do not lend to making him a trustworthy narrator. If anything, one could say that the author of this book is an unreliable narrator, which is also a case in point for the book's thesis. Lennon is examining not only the prison system, but also the concept of rehabilitation. He has succeeded in creating a career as a journalist while being incarcerated. And he does ask the questions, do I deserve to have this? At what point can I be allowed to better my life? Does this horrible thing I did, the worst thing I ever did, is that always going to be a shadow in his present? But as the reader, especially as a window reader, you want to be cautious. Violent criminals are often skilled at manipulation and presenting themselves in a very specific, intentional way. And that reason alone makes it impossible for me to truly trust Lennon as the narrator. So I'm interested in the topic and the thesis while also not trusting the storyteller. That is atypical for well-written memoir. I would call this book well-written, and it is atypical to not trust the narrator. And yet this is still a very interesting book. And I guess you could say that Lennon is an authority on prison culture and life behind bars, and probably a lot of ins and outs of the criminal justice system that I am not an expert on. But as far as establishing meaning from that, in almost every other memoir with that authoritative narrator, the narrator is going to guide the reader through that experience and kind of guide them toward a general conclusion. In this case, the reader is more likely inclined to make their own conclusions about what Lennon presents and not rely primarily on the author. And again, I don't really know what that says about me as a human or him as a human. I do not trust him as a narrator. I can consume what he writes and take that into consideration, but I personally feel like there's a lot on me as the reader to interpret and make conclusions from, where I do not want to just take Lennon's word for it. Let's talk about the impact of this book. Again, this is an unusual memoir to bring to the podcast, but there's just so many ways that you can tell your personal story in a way that is meaningful to someone else, and I really found this format compelling. I read this book pretty quickly. I did not want to linger because it is heavy and dark, and because of the unreliable nature of the narrator, I wouldn't have felt too safe hanging out in this memoir for longer than necessary. I was also really glad that I had a friend who read this at the same time that I did. Talking it over with her was really helpful for me as I metabolized this memoir true crime hybrid, and I felt that together we were able to engage with Lennon's thesis without having to rely on a narrator whom we perceived as potentially unreliable. So the impact of the tragedy of true crime on me as a reader was pretty close to what I suspect Lennon wanted. I have been having conversations about true crime and incarceration with other people. I've been checking myself as I evaluate different true crime stories and how the stories are presented. There's already a lot out there about the ethics of true crime, and Lennon's book here adds to that conversation. Overall, this book added a depth to the true crime conversation that isn't always represented. Again, I don't know how reliable this author is, despite his journalism credentials, but the sparked conversation is really what any writer wants, and that is what the author achieves here. So before we close out, I just want to give a brief shout out to the Chapter 1 Jumpstart Challenge. I'm currently 1 day into this challenge. This is a 5-day workshop where I walk you through revising one chapter of your memoir draft. We're basically tackling writer's block on a much more micro level that will give you a small win that will feel massive. If you've listened to both parts of this Why It Works or Not series, then you'll be familiar with how I examine memoir. First the foundation and then the narrative, and that is the basic skeleton for what I'm teaching you to do with your writing in your memoir draft. So head to the link in the show notes to sign up for that. You can catch up on days 1 and 2 and pace with us then for the rest of the week. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm so glad that I could talk about this book with you. That is the end of this month's Why It Works or Not series, and I will see you on Friday.
You've just listened to an episode of the Memoir Method podcast. The Memoir Method podcast is presented by Charlotte Writes. If you liked what you heard, the best way to support the show is to subscribe through your preferred podcast player. And if you're feeling especially inspired, I'd love it if you left a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. Leaving a review really does help other readers and writers like yourself find the show. If you want to continue the conversation, you can find me on my website at charlottewrites.co or on Instagram at charlottejanewrites. Thank you for tuning in. I'll see you next time. And remember that you have a story that matters.